Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and peace be upon you all. You're most welcome to the Shari'ah Intelligence course, where we will be looking at the critical thinking tools of Islamic jurisprudence. I am your host, Muhammad Nurudeen Lemu, and with me to discuss today's questions are two of our top trainers and facilitators, volunteers of the Dawah Institute, Brother Ibrahim Bello and Brother Nasir Bello. You're both most welcome.
Thank you very much.
Today we will be looking at the foreword of the training manual, the book Shari'ah Intelligence. We will be looking at the preface of this book and looking really at why it was put together, the lessons we need to remember from those who helped put this course together. Especially we will be looking at the foreword and the points that Shaykh Ahmad Lemu, Allah yarhamuhu, our board of trustee member and actually the president of the Islamic Education Trust now, inshallah with Allah, and the points he mentioned, why he felt this course was important for Muslims, in other words, the justification for the Shari'ah Intelligence course. And I'd like to start there with the question to Brother Ibrahim Bello. What are some of the key points raised in the foreword of the course book by late Shaykh Ahmad Lemu, the former Grand Qadi of Niger State, and also King Faisal Award prize receiver, who has been the chairman of the board of trustees of this organization, but a respected scholar in Nigeria and beyond? Could you share or expound on some of these points for a better understanding of the reasons behind the development of this course? Brother Ibrahim.
Alhamdulillah, like you say earlier, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continue to have mercy on the soul of late Shaykh Ahmad Lemu. May Allah accept his works and efforts and continue to make them fruitful. The course, like he said in the manual, come timely in response to challenges of Muslim communities in this way. You've got age-long traditional literature that people have lived on and has served as a source of guidance that were prepared by scholars earlier on. While these materials were very useful and relevant and serve as the basis of learning religion, but then some of the issues addressed in those manuals were specific to the realities of their time. And they differ depending on where you go from different parts of the world. Now you start having, that is like literatures that were written 1,000 years ago exactly or thereabout. Well, you will have no problem with issues of prayer, ablution, Hajj, and all rituals of religion. Other non-religious, non-worship side of it, mu'amalat, that were tied to context and realities of that time, changed. And more so, even if they don't change, even at that time, they were contextual depending on where you are. So you come to discover that you have Muslims who still held on to these things, forgetting that these scholars did their best, and Quran and Sunnah were their original source. And so when you start having issues that people need to shift ground because the reality and the socio-cultural realities or changes have come in, people still held on these things as immutable, as like they are divine in themselves. And so this becomes like stumbling block to the flow and propagation of Islam and understanding of Islam by new Muslims. And it makes Islam look like different religions just because of different understanding. So instead of focusing energy on preaching Islam to non-Muslims, Muslims now focus on that intrafaith differences, which ordinarily understanding the working mechanism of Islam, which is usul al-fiqh and qawaid al-fiqhiyya and maqasid al-shari'ah, if well expounded and understood earlier, would have cleared this trouble. So why it was okay for people to have broad general knowledge of Islam, there are areas where you need to really know why and how did scholars arrive at this. So why it is good to have people that are broad and shallow, you also need to respect specialties and scholarship. But because of ignorance of this, it compounds the problem. In fact, sometimes you tell people that Quran and Sunnah is this, like they don't look of their own understanding of mazhab to be less than this. Unfortunately, if these scholars were around, some of these things were actually not like that. So this is why this course come to like explain or clarify. And similarly, you're dealing with a world where you have more diverse socio-cultural group. In a more globalized world, you have people coming from like 20 different countries, each with his own conviction and understanding of what Islam should be and what Islam should not be based on his conviction. Where do you have a common ground for them to really understand that we all have the same intent and we're heading to the same direction? So this is why it has become necessary to come up with courses like this, so that people will be on the same page and they can understand why the differences and also which issues do they continue to hold on to. And also the scholars of the past that arrive at some of these answers and texts and literature, how did they come about it? And what are those issues that are no longer relevant to our realities that we can move on if we actually knew their methodologies? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Nasir, what would you add from this?
Actually, some of the important and interesting points made by Sheikh Ahmed Lemu, rahimahullah, actually underscoring or trying to understand the reality of the world we live in, how the dynamic nature of our globalized world actually affect and lead to the emergence of a variety of minority positions even within families, and how the cyberspace is littered with what we call fatwa shops that don't necessarily appreciate the relevance of context and of course consider any established criteria of issuing fatwa. And therefore he suggests the need to employ the usul, the maqasid and the qawaid compass, which is based on the Quran and Sunnah, as a tool or a mechanism that will help us navigate through this kind of complexity and confusing reality. He also talked about the need for us to look at usul or Shari'ah intelligence being a process that guides the process of doing ijtihad and production of fatwa, that guides the ummah, more similar to the field of medicine, as against what usually the erroneous paradigm of looking at it as mathematics, where you come up or you are expected to come up with one definite answer. That just like in the field of medicine, you look at the context, you look at so many variables, and therefore the position or the end result or the outcome will eventually be context specific as against something that is more generalized. And because of that, he stressed on the importance of appreciating ethics of disagreement, because naturally when you have a difference in context, be it cultural or geographic context or any other factor that will define the specific nature or uniqueness of a particular individual, that creates a room for appreciation of ethics of disagreement in the production or in the process of ijtihad. And that also stressed the need for us to see the idea of unity as not being uniformity, that unity accommodates this variety, or unity, our unity is not influenced by the variety of differences that we might have as a result of our individual contextual differences. Allahu Alam.
Thank you very much. And I like this metaphor or this last statement, that unity does not mean uniformity. It doesn't mean that you are disunited just because you have differing opinions. Sahaba had differing opinions among themselves, but they are those things that they all had in common, which was and is always important for us to remember and hold on to. And one of the points, I think, just to emphasize, which came from that foreword, was the importance of generating more curiosity in the population about the subject of usulul fiqh, qawaid al-fiqhiyya and maqasid sharia. That these three pillars of ijtihad, these three major subjects are so critical, not just for scholars to have. They need to master these subjects if ijtihad is to be guided properly, if they are to understand where mujtahids are coming from. But in the general population of people who listen to one opinion and they say it's wrong because majority says something else, where there's no respect for specialization. And one of the problems there is when people don't know enough about the methodology of scholars, they unfortunately do not appreciate the relevance and correctness and appropriateness of a contemporary fatwa over a past fatwa that might have been good for its own context, but very irrelevant and sometimes very dangerous and disastrous to the ummah or to humanity today. So this understanding is important, not just for the for scholars and those active in da'wah and Islamic work to understand, but those who are interested in understanding diversity to try and understand the paradigms and the methodologies used by scholars of the past. Otherwise, every time you ask a question, somebody goes back into history and stops somewhere in history. Why? Because we are not able to do what the scholars did, which was to go back to the Quran and Sunnah using the methodologies that scholars have developed from the time of the Sahaba and apply that to current context. Many of us, instead of going back to Quran and Sunnah, just go back to Imam al-Ghazali, or go back to Ibn Taymiyyah, or go back to Ibn Hazm, or a particular scholar, and treating scholarly opinions as if those were evidence, instead of understanding that the opinion of a scholar is based on evidence that usulul fiqh and these subjects try to study and analyze. The next question I'd like to ask, starting with you, Brother Nasir, we also have the preface to the Shari'ah Intelligence manual. What are those points that the preface tries to remind us about or inform us about as we move into this course?
Well, in the preface, some of the points made were actually connected to the history or the evolution of the course Shari'ah Intelligence. It speaks to the effort by the Dawah Institute of Nigeria of trying to gather questions that for over 2 decades, the Dawah Institute of Nigeria has been trying to generate questions and concerns from young Muslims across the world, from over 20 countries, where it's actually asked about troubling questions, faith-shaking questions, conscience-disturbing questions. And some of the response that actually were generated from this 20 years or even more of questioning and survey are actually issues around around violent extremism, issues around gender, interfaith relations, and the Shari'ah Intelligence and many other courses developed by the Dawah Institute of Nigeria are actually an attempt to resolve these issues coming from the tradition of Islam. And something that seems quite peculiar with almost all the questions that were actually generated is this absence of triangulation from the fatwas that actually create sort of a problem in the understanding of young Muslims across the world. And by triangulation, of course, we are talking about trying to look at the product of using usul, maqasid, qawaid independently in trying to resolve some of the issues or problems that actually emanate from the questions and concerns of young Muslims around the world.
This is very true. I think, the Dawah Institute, as you've mentioned, has for decades been conducting surveys to understand the troubling questions, the faith-shaking questions, the questions that come either very lax or come from another point of extremism or violent extremism on various themes you've mentioned. And something we find in common with the faulty fatwas is that they lack a grounding in usul, or they lack a grounding in qawaid and maqasid, that they lack support from one of these three major fields. Brother Ibrahim Bello, what more could you add to the points raised by Nasir?
So, based on what he has explained earlier, looking at the relevance of the course. Like any other specialty, one could say it is fardu kifaya. But if you really want to speak and you want to be faithful to the source and also realistic today, then it becomes fardu ain for anybody that is involved in da'wah.
Fardu ain being like an individual
obligation
to study, as
in
opposed
da'wah
to just,
or Muslim scholarship to really have this good background. Because if you don't have some grounding in this area, you'll be speaking with the language of the old to the people of this generation. You will find it difficult to make Islam look relevant to our time. In fact, it might seem Islam doesn't even have answer to the challenges of our time. So it becomes fardu ain for anybody in da'wah, in this global world, where the click of a button, people can access fatwa from various scholars around the world, irrespective of their context. Where before people ask you, they've gotten some YouTube video circulating, where people generalize what was supposed to be contextual. So these are the kind of things that will help you to sieve, to harmonize, to filter, to really weigh and see, okay, which of them is appropriate to your context. And like Nasir mentioned earlier, with Islam, the answers are not just like 1 + 1 is 2. It's more like medicine and diagnosis, where a drug might be relevant for this context, but not for this. It might be for the same case, but for different people. So it's not just about right and wrong. So this is why this course is becoming much and more important for anybody in da'wah. Recently, in our contemporary world, in the last century or thereabout, you've got some classical Muslim scholars that specialize and got recognition in this area. You have Mufti Muhammad Taqi Usmani, late Taha Jabir Al-Alwani, Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah bin Bayah, Wahab Zuhaili, Muhammad Hashim Kamali, and a number of them. Akram Nyazi, Sheikh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, a number of them. All of these scholars, in reality, they spent serious time and made a lot of effort and research, including Sheikh Jasser Auda, Tariq Ramadan, and a number of them. These scholars have spent time and made deep research into these areas. They specialize in trying to use this area and expound and popularize this field of knowledge. So it's an area that we really need to look into. And I want to believe is one of the key things lacking, and like we mentioned earlier, and people were just giving faulty fatwa. Because it is about how to issue fatwa. People don't even know what are the key rulings guiding fatwa. How do you cross-check a fatwa? What is the scale of measuring fatwa? Okay, so these kind of things are important because we continue having new issues. We're not mujtahids, but we need some common sense on usulul fiqh and maqasidul sharia and qawaidul fiqh here to help us recognize which fatwa is not faithful to the established standard by scholars.
Enhanced version of common sense.
Really enhanced version of common sense.
Yeah, as you put it, we need to understand Islam in a sensible manner that is faithful to the Quran, to the Sunnah, to the principles laid down from the time of the Prophet and the Sahaba, and to really appreciate, and I think one would add to the list scholars like Sheikh Ahmad Raisuni, Umar Farooq Abdullah, and there are quite a number, Akram Laldeen, and a number of those that you've mentioned, Abu Zahra, etc. I think the IIIT in particular, but I'm sure other organizations have actually, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, identified that these fields are very important if all scholars agree that with changing context you will have change in fatwas. In areas of mu'amalat, in particular social interactions, worldly mundane issues, as contexts change, as times change, as situations change, the rulings on many of these issues will change to keep up with the times. But if we do not understand the methodology of juristic reasoning, if we do not understand that, both from the side of scholars, you will find a problem of dentists trying to do the job of a gynecologist. something that is not in their specialization. We find muhaddith now dabbling into fiqh and mufassir dabbling into fiqh. People with certain specializations, unfortunately, being asked questions and they speak, and they're very popular, but they speak outside their fields of specialization. But at the same time, we have the problem on the side of the patient who has a problem and takes his pregnant wife to see a dentist, where somebody takes a problem and doesn't really appreciate that just because you are called a doctor doesn't automatically mean you could be a dentist, you could be a psychiatrist. People just look at it. The moment you're called Shaykh or Ustaz, it means you can answer all questions. So the need to really appreciate specializations, I think, is something that cuts across the board. I'd like to ask Brother Ibrahim Bello, just as we start to wrap up, on the issues to do with this course, what are the major objectives which you hope we will realize during this course? So by the end of this course, what do participants expect to go away with? And what analogies or metaphors do you think could help us explain and understand better the objectives of this course? Malam Ibrahim.
What this course tends to do is, number one, to introduce the audience or the students of knowledge to classical methodology of formulating fatwas. Like, it's not just saying the scholars say this is haram. It's in our compendiums of fiqh of this and all these rulings and fatwas that have been generated over the years. But how do they get to it? So it's like knowing the parts of the car earlier on, but the course is now trying to teach you how do they work. This is number one. Number two, to introduce the audience or the students of knowledge to why scholars differ. You can see how they reason. If you are exposed to how they reason, you can see, okay, they are bound to differ because of the nature of the text itself and the scholarship and the angle and the specialization. It's like a model or methodology. So if you are coming from a different paradigm, you are likely to see it like this. If you are coming from a different paradigm, you are likely to see it in a different way. What this does is it blows the gap or the line of divide intra-faith. Then you can respect and appreciate, okay, yes. It's not necessarily that you agree, but you respect and appreciate why. Another thing is for us to see the nuance and the different terminologies and technicalities they use. Because sometimes the differences are just more semantic. Sometimes it's because you don't know their own technicalities and the jargons. And these jargons or technicalities, let me use, even in mazahib. One mazhab will say this is rukun, this one will say fard. Some differentiate between fard and wajib. In some technicalities and specialties, you have sunnah to mean something less obligatory. While in some other places, sunnah just means the prophetic way of doing it. While. So usulul fiqh and maqasid sharia and the whole of this course, part of the things is to do is to expose us and let us see the terminologies and the technicalities used by various scholars. Another thing the course does is for us to respect difference in scholarship and for us to appreciate and tolerate. Tolerating and appreciating doesn't mean you are compromising, but it just means you accept you don't know it all, the other person might be right. And particularly when you come to hear that great scholars also have this view, but also to equip you with a way of a quick check of no, this fatwa is not correct. Islam cannot just give this verdict. In other words, it's supposed to identify a fatwa that has not been formulated in line with the established standards by scholars. So these are some of the key things this course tends to achieve at the end of the day. That somebody that has gone through this course will appreciate that with the change in context we expect a change in fatwa. And like we say, people should separate between things that are yani thawabit and mutaghayyirat. Thawabit, nothing will change the rakah of prayers. Nothing will change how you perform ablution. Nothing will change the rites of Hajj. Nothing would, but a number of other things outside the cycle of ibadah, which is very small compared to our real life interpersonal relations, and new issues continue coming up. Whether some of those fatwas or those mu'amala issues need to change depending on who you are, where you are, and the realities of our time. All of these courses equip you with all of those tools.
This is interesting, the distinction, as you were mentioning, between the thawabit, those more permanent, stable aspects of Sharia, or the Islamic way of life, or Islamic law, to be more precise, and the mutaghayyirat, those things that are open to change, those things that respond to context. So you would find articles of faith, our belief in God, and some of those very stable. They don't change in any significant way over time. The primary parts actually stay stable. The acts of worship stay pretty stable, unless you're going to ask where's the Qibla if you're in, on the moon. So there are some of those that are subject to change. But the big areas of change, as you've mentioned, are the mu'amalat, and those things that are based on evidence that is dhanni. Those evidence or pieces of evidence, proofs that are of a level of presumption, not the level of certainty that we get for the fundamentals of the deen. And just to stop looking at Islamic law in a very simplistic, mathematical way, to recognize, just as you've mentioned before, like medicine, what would be medicine for one person may not be the same as another person who may be pregnant or may be underaged, or on other medication. Regarding the question of objectives, expectations, Malan Nasir, what would you add?
Well, I think another important objective is the need to develop greater respect for diversity, particularly when faced with legitimate difference of opinion, to acknowledge the fact that naturally, the fact that people have different contexts, you would find them differing on the processes of arriving at a particular position or goal, be it in cooking, be it in the making of tea or any other thing. You would always find differences in how things are done. So long as it is a legitimate difference of opinion, participant or those going through this course need to understand the need for greater respect for diversity. We've also talked about how context influence these outcomes, and therefore it is one of the very critical objectives of this important course. Another thing is to become conscious of searching for specialists, particularly on issues that appear very important or controversial. Sometimes you find, just like we said, particularly the cyberspace is littered with a lot of shops that are actually coming up with fatwa. But the thing is, how do you differentiate this particular fatwa with this fatwa? Sometimes it's about trying to understand those speaking. Are they really specialists in this particular field, or it is somebody that is actually intruding who probably knows quite little about the processes of ijtihad and what have you. Another very good and very important objective of this course is the need to understand what to do when scholars differ without necessarily destroying brotherhood and civility. That when there is difference of opinion among scholars, what are we supposed to do, such that we don't actually create a problem that is much bigger than what is already existing, or what the existing fatwas are actually out there to solve. So these are the things that I think are part of the objectives that are really important in this course.
I'd like to ask you just to elaborate more, and if for those who are new to this whole area, you could share more metaphors that would help us appreciate the importance of and the distinction between the fields like usul, qawaid, maqasid. For some people, usulul fiqh, they're hearing it for the first time. What exactly do we mean by principles of Islamic jurisprudence? What do we mean by qawaid al-fiqhiyya, Islamic legal maxims? What do we mean by the higher intents and objectives of Sharia or maqasid Sharia? How would you present these with more simple examples that average people can
well, I think ordinarily the field of usul al-fiqh, maqasir, qawaid used to be quite elitist, very complex, and the fact that, as we rightly mentioned, that the whole world is actually experiencing a seismic shift. The dynamic is quite overwhelming, and therefore there is this need to elevate the understanding of many Muslims to the processes, at least to be able to familiarize oneself to these complexities in this very important field of knowledge, to resolve some of the issues that are out there. And therefore lots of metaphors were actually used to simplify some of the very complex and difficult concepts in this particular subject area. For example, in trying to understand who a mujtahid is and what role he plays in the processes of ijtihad, usually metaphors like the master chef and what he does with the available ingredients in order to achieve producing a delicious meal is actually employed, because ijtihad is actually the effort exerted by a mujtahid, as earlier defined, with the available tools in trying to come up with a better and effective solution to a problem. And therefore that is exactly what a master chef does. He uses the available ingredients to produce a delicious meal, or a fisherman with the available tools in order to do his usually the normal work of trying to catch fish. And so again, if in trying to describe or explain the idea of usul al-fiqh being a methodological equation in arriving at fatwa, you would find scholars trying to bring the metaphor of board maths, which is a standard methodology applied by mathematicians in trying to solve an equation. And therefore usul al-fiqh for the scholars of Islam is just like a board maths in mathematics. It's just a methodology that is standardized, employed by different group of scholars in trying to arrive at a ruling or a verdict that in their own understanding is the most effective way of representing Rasulullah in his absence. And also another metaphor that is used by scholars is that metaphor of the traffic rule, where they will say the driver's manual that guides the driver as to how he drives in the city is what we call usul al-fiqh. It is the guiding principle that helps him to drive. And the traffic light or the traffic rule that guides the process of drivers navigating through different roads in the city is like your qawaid, because it deals with application, it deals with regulating the application space. And the destination that the driver hopes to get to is what we call maqasidu sharia. So you need all the three for you to have an effective movement and effective navigation through the city. And another example that is often used is the metaphor of actually preparing a meal, serving it, and testing whether it's nice. So preparing the meal, what guides the process of the preparation of the meal is usul al-fiqh. Serving the meal is the application, that is the qawaid, and of course testing whether it tastes nice, trying to find out whether it tastes nice, whether it meets the objective of the cooking or the production of the meal from the very beginning is the maqasid. So these are some metaphors that actually speaks to the idea of making or crafting laws, which is the domain of usul al-fiqh, or the law application, or the application of law, which is actually the qawaid or qawaid al-fiqhiyya. And the last segment of effective problem solving, whether this process of law making, this process of law application actually has helped in arriving at the goal, addressing the problem that is at stake. For example, you may find a legally correct position that probably has not effectively solved the problem. Example, is there anything wrong, for example, with the case of issue of calling a non-Muslim a kafir? What will that do, for example, to peaceful coexistence? Will that resolve the problem of interfaith relations in the Muslim community? Probably you can argue that yes, if you look at the usul, the Quran has addressed them as such, but or if you look at the linguistic meaning, but the fact that they don't like it the fact that it will create, friction between Muslim communities, has it really achieved the maqasid of interfaith relations or peace building or not? Or for example, the case of forced marriage, the legality of forced rape in marriage, and all that. So these are some of the examples that scholars usually use, and you would find many of them in the Sharia Intelligence course that attempts to simplify the whole idea of the complex subject of usul, maqasid and qawaid for better understanding.
I like that. And just before we conclude, Mala Ibrahim, what would you add to
I also like the idea of having a car and knowing how to drive does not suffice, but you need to know traffic rules and regulations. But that's not enough if you just actually don't have a destination. So if we look at the body of Islamic literature, the text of Quran and Sharia, they are broad, they are diverse. And we were not there. A number of contextual gaps, things that are tied to context we don't know. So this field is actually what refines our way of thinking and understanding it. And like he said, it's not just about making the law that is the concern, or applying the law. It's for the law to achieve its objectives. So all of these three are relevant, and that is exactly how people should treat this course. It is not new, like we say, but it's a forgotten or neglected area which we really need now, much more than ever. But for us to look at it in this perspective, that why usulul fiqh is like knowing how to drive. You have a car, you can drive. Qawaid, if you don't know traffic rules, you do much more harm than good. Okay, you know traffic rules, you know how to drive. You just need to have a direction, you need to have a compass. So that if you miss all direction or you disagree, all of you will agree on this is our goal. And this is what helped scholars in the past to harmonize their differences and respect one another, and they were united in intent and purpose, irrespective of whether the approach were different.
This is wonderful, and I like the metaphor you used for a mujtahid who is a distinguished jurist in this field, being similar to that of a master chef, somebody who is really good with cooking, and in whatever situation he or she finds themselves, the master chef knows how to make the best food with whatever ingredients are available, because sometimes the Quran doesn't address a particular issue, sometimes the Sunnah doesn't address a particular issue, and all the scholar is left with is maybe just public consideration, compassion, handling a victim, etc., and how these are the tools that help the mujtahid in reaching opinions. I like fishing, and sometimes I would probably say a mujtahid is like a fisherman, who he is good with his fishing equipment. He is not the one who he doesn't maybe know how to make a hook, he doesn't know how to make the line, he doesn't know how to make a fishing rod, but he knows how to put it together. He knows how to get something from the specialist who makes the hooks, because just as the specialist may know how to make hooks but is not good at fishing, somebody may know how to make fishing line but not know how to catch a particular fish. So the mujtahid is like the fisherman who is able to get the benefits from the various specializations of scholars of hadith and scholars of tafsir and scholars of language and on usul and principles and methodology, etc., and ensure that they are able to successfully land a good fish. You mentioned BODMAS, this order of mathematical operations, that in mathematics you do things in brackets first, before you go to things that are to the order of, and then you will divide before you multiply, and then add before you subtract. That there's an order that scholars use when they address issues. It's not just haphazard, it's not just arbitrary, it's not just an answer that hasn't got a process, and part of what this course plans to do is actually look at that operating system, look at the protocols, look at the methodology, what you call the research analysis and the prescription methodology that scholars go through when giving fatwas. And of course, a lot of new issues coming, a lot of ijtihad taking place. The world is very broad. People in some further developed nations than others who are less developed, everyone with various contexts, but we are very much connected through the internet, and to recognize how fatwas in one context would not apply to another. As you mentioned, like medicine, the medicine for malaria may be correct, but this particular malaria medicine may be for a child, not for an adult, and this is for an adult, but not for an adult that has another underlying condition. And probably the last point that you mentioned, and you used a couple of examples, some that some would consider controversial, like whether they can be marital rape or not, whether you can call a non-Muslim a kafir, which for many non-Muslims is an insulting term. Actually, for many Muslims, it's an insulting term, and how by looking at just the evidence from the side of usul in a narrow sense, you could say, well, you could call him a kafir because Allah calls him a kafir. You could call him a Christian because the Quran also uses the word Christian. You could call him Ahl al-Kitab, various terms. But when you look at the same question from the perspective of the Qawaid al-Fiqhiyah, Islamic legal maxims, Islamic legal philosophy, the harm it causes, when you look at it from the same perspective, another perspective of the Quran and Sunnah, where we are looking at the objectives of human dignity and the protection and preservation of ird, etc., we get to see there may be other terms that may be more appropriate from a holistic assessment of the issue, and not just looking at it from the usul only in a narrow sense, but looking at it, as you put it, triangulation, cross-examination of the same issue, but from other angles that the Quran and Sunnah presents, which we call the usul, the qawaid, and the maqasid. So inshallah, this hopefully would be a very interesting journey as we go through this course, and we pray that Allah guides and protects us, forgive us for our mistakes, but looking forward to a lot of interesting metaphors for those who are new to this technical subject. Inshallah, as we go through and keep repeating the terms, a lot of the new terms that some of us may be not very familiar with, ijtihad, mujtahid, fiqh, etc., etc. A lot of terms that will become clearer as we move through them with more examples, more analogies, more metaphors, and may Allah bless this journey. Thank you very much for your contributions. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.